Everyone, thank you all for being with us today. This is our state board info webinar. We want to appreciate you all and our panelists for being here. Just as a reminder, this webinar today is to inform voters on what the state board is, what their role is, and why it's important for you all to do your research when voting for the State Board of Education. Today, if you have any questions, you can submit those through the Zoom DM, and hopefully we can get to them. And if we're not able to, we will be sure to follow up with folks. We're going to start off by letting our great panelists introduce themselves, what your role is, and your organization. And if you can speak more to what your organization does for our viewers who may not know about you, that would be great.
I'm happy to start. Hey everyone, my name is Sam Battan. I'm the founder and executive director of the Colorado Youth Congress. And CYC is a statewide youth organizing group. We work with high school students across Colorado in order to enact systems change. Olivia, you want to go?
Yeah, hi, I'm Olivia. I'm a programming intern for CYC. So I help with creating meetings and with technical stuff with CYC. And I'm excited to be on this webinar.
I can jump in, but go ahead, Sandy.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. My name is Sandy. I'm currently a student. I'm a senior at Denver School of the Arts, and I'm a member of CYC. This is my second year working on the mental health campaign.
All right, I'll jump in now. Hey, everybody, I'm Stephanie Perez Carillo. I work at the Colorado Children's Campaign. We're a statewide policy and advocacy organization. I think our mission is just to realize every chance for every child. We work in the realms of K through 12, health, and early childhood, and we've been doing so for over 30 years now. So happy to be here, and thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Hi everyone, my name is Deja. I am a junior at DSST College View High School, and I am a part of the CYC Mental Health Campaign. This is my third year.
Great, and hey everyone, my name is Dan Schaller. I'm the president of the Colorado League of Charter Schools. We're a statewide organization that represents all the charter schools, the 260 charter schools all across the state of Colorado, including Deja School, DSST. And grateful to be here today and participating in this conversation.
Great, thank you all. And my name is Valeria Contreras, and I'm the advocacy director at A+ Colorado. I want to thank you all again for your time. And we're going to have an opening from Sam, so I'll give it to you, Sam.
Thanks. So I'd love to just start with within my experience with the State Board of Education and what I think is important. So after a decade of teaching, I still wasn't quite sure what the State Board did and what powers they had. And it wasn't really until I was talking to one of my students, Jasmine, who was a junior at the time in Longmont, and she was telling me about how she had trouble. Both of her parents are disabled, and she was responsible for helping her youngest brother transition from elementary to middle school. And she had trouble figuring out which school was best. And she was looking online and had a really hard time finding data around which school served their students the best. And so the Colorado Youth Congress joined the Right to Know campaign, which was led by A+ and Colorado Children's Campaign. And we went to testify at the state board. And so Jasmine stood up there and she shared her story about how she really was having a hard time figuring out the choice of where her younger brother should go to school. And you know, the state board members politely listened, you know, nodded their heads that they were intently listening. And at the end, we all walked out to the lobby. And there was a staffer from the Colorado Department of Education that came out and assisted Jasmine. So she brought her laptop out to the lobby. She's like, hey, Jasmine, can I talk to you? And Jasmine went over and she started showing Jasmine on the CDE website where to find the data that Jasmine was looking for. But it took almost 15 minutes to find that data, and, you know, 50, 60 clicks through a website, a labyrinth website. And wow, I think, you know, what that showed me was that there's a lot of good intentions and well-intentioned folks who are working for the state board and Department of Ed, but as a system, it is not very responsive to the needs of young people. And so I think that's the reason why I'm participating and CYC is participating today, is because we all should be pushing for the state board to be responsive to the needs of parents and be responsive to the needs of students.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. First question, and this can be answered by anyone, is what is the State Board of Education?
And sorry, I have something in my throat. I might let Stephanie start off on that one.
I'll jump in, Dan. I hope you can clear that up. So the State Board is essentially the governing body of the Department of Education. It's made up of elected officials. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what they can and can't do and what is within their powers, but it's important to know that the decisions that they make largely impact the Department of Education for the state. So that's the long and short of it.
Yeah, and I apologize again. I've just built off of that to say, yeah, they are, one of their core responsibilities is hiring and determining who the Commissioner of Education, who's currently Katie Anthus for the state of Colorado. And then in addition to that, I think of them as overseeing three sort of big buckets. If there are laws written across the street at the state capitol that require specific rules to say how they will be enacted, they help determine what those rules will be. They make a lot of determinations around accountability, and this kind of connects back to what Sam was talking about before. Like if schools are struggling in the state, we have what's called an accountability clock, where they are held accountable for the results they are getting. And so they, if they're struggling long enough, they have to go before the State Board of Education to determine what the game plan and the plan of attack is going to be to get better. And then a third area where they have a lot of impact is in the charter school space, frankly, where if there is a decision about a charter school that a local school district makes, that there's a dispute about, the State Board of Education makes determinations about the final outcome of that decision. We can talk more about that over the course of the rest of the conversation, but those are a few of the big buckets that they hit on.
Thank you both. A follow-up question, and I don't know this, but do you all know if state board members are paid?
They are not paid. They receive stipends for expenses associated, or the expenses that they incur with their roles. So if they're, you have, if you have a school board member who's traveling to a school to maybe visit, to have a conversation with the principal, or just to, have a town hall, it's possible that they have to drive several hours. When you think of Joyce Rankin, who kind of represents the Western Slope, she has to drive to Denver to be part of the State Board of Ed meetings under normal circumstances. Under COVID, I think the department and the State Board of Ed have had to be really flexible in terms of, how they're hosting their meetings and how they're allowing people to participate. But for the most part, it includes expenses around food and lodging, and mileage reimbursement, but they're not actually paid a stipend or a salary in the way that one would be paid for a typical job.
Thank you, Stephanie. Moving on with question is, do you know who historically has sat on the State Board of Education from your personal experience, and then also if you all are familiar and aware of the history of the state of Colorado?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things I'd point to there is it's 7 members currently, and that is lined up with how many congressional districts we have in the state of Colorado. And so one of those congressional districts encompasses primarily Denver. So that's one of the seats, but then you have 6 other seats that cover all different parts of the state. So that is sort of the composition that makes up the state board. Now, if the number of congressional seats changes, which a lot of people are expecting after we go through the next census count and finalize those numbers, and we go through a redistricting process, some people are anticipating we're going to grow to 8 congressional seats. There will be a growth in the number of people that are sitting on the state board. It does always have to be an odd number. So if there are 8 congressional seats, there will be an additional 9th seat added for somebody who's called an at-large candidate, which would be voted on and representative of the entire state of Colorado. I will say the other interesting fact is that up until a few years ago, the State Board of Education had been controlled by Republicans for 4 decades. But then in just the past 4 years, there has been a flip in the control. So it is now 4 Democrats to 3 Republicans, and we'll see what that looks like coming out of this next election cycle.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing that's kind of important to note is what positions State Board of Ed members can't hold. For example, they can't be a legislator or the member of a General Assembly while they're a State Board of Ed member. They can't be on a local board and serve as a State Board member. So there are kind of limitations to roles that they can serve outside of the State Board if they want to serve on the State Board. And Dan mentioned something really important around the possibility to gain another congressional district. And what's important to know is that every 2 years, you're not voting on all seats. You're voting on just a few seats every 2 years. So for example, this year you're voting on districts 1, 3, and 7, which are currently represented by Val Flores, Joyce Rankin, and Jane Goff. And so those are up for re-election. And then in 2 years, two different seats will be up for re-election. So the process isn't such that every 2 years you're voting for new state board members. They usually serve 6 years and are limited to 2 terms. So for example, Val Flores is actually termed out. And so her seat has to be reassigned, and anybody can actually run for state board. If you are a person who is registered to vote, who feels strongly about wanting to get a seat on the state board, you can run. It's the same process as running for an elected position. You would have to go through the Secretary of State process, but these are elected positions. And so it's important to note that the people that are serving on this board have been elected by the people of Colorado.
Thank you for that. Speaking to the role of the state board, we just had a question come in. Can the State Board of Education or its elected officials mandate schools collect and report certain data?
So the state board, in this circumstance, is largely acting out of the laws that get passed by the legislature. And so under state law in Colorado, we have school performance framework requirements that dictate kind of how accountability for schools needs to be assessed. And then the state board takes that and works to implement it and put it into practice. And so they set the rules and the guidelines by which those laws then get translated into what are the exact ways in which we are assessing how our schools are doing in the state of Colorado.
Thank you for that, Dan. Another question is, what is the state board's role in improving schools in the state?
You want to start on that one, Stephanie?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think they touch on several different pieces. Dan alluded to some of the work that happens across the street at the legislature, where if you've heard of committees that are being created outside of session, or you've heard of very specific groups that are created as a result of legislation, some state board members serve as liaisons in that process, and they serve as 2-year terms. So you have some State Board of Ed members that serve on those respective committees. And I guess as it relates to some of the other pieces, they regulate educator licensing. Dan talked about the accountability process. They oversee that. They supervise, adult basic education and public libraries. And, they exercise judicial authority with regard to appeals by charter schools, which I think you heard a little bit more from Dan earlier. And so I think there are a lot of things that are within their purview, and they don't necessarily they're not necessarily in the local systems making that change, but they do have some governing authority in some areas. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I might just add, so every school in the state has to come up with what's called a unified improvement plan on a regular basis to demonstrate how they are on the path towards continuously improving. And those all get submitted to the state. And as I mentioned before, if a school is struggling in some of our lowest performance categories on a consistent basis, there is an increasing like ladder of engagement that the state gets involved. And that is often where the state board gets involved in determining, like, if you're a school that has been in one of the lowest performance categories for 5 years or so, the state board, you have to go down to the state board and have a conversation about what's going on. And that is oftentimes when the state board will set directives for how that school needs to improve its performance, or risk having more and more changes made.
Great, thank you. Students, this question is specifically for you all. I'm assuming you all in your role with CYC have had some experience giving testimony to elected officials or maybe district officials. In your experience with that, or maybe even having testified to the state board, how would you all say the state board could become more accessible to students or families, or maybe any community member?
I don't have experience personally with the state board, but I have testified in front of the Denver Public School Board. And I think like before I joined CYC and met people who were connected, I didn't even realize that like those community testimonies were possible. Like I didn't know they were meetings. I didn't know it was an option to stand before members and say what you wanted to say. So I think like spreading more awareness that that is something possible, and that if students or community members have something they would like to say to these elected officials, it should be more common knowledge that you are able to do that, and it is possible to become like personally involved in people with that kind of political and judicial power.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sandy. To students, it feels like one of those things where you need to have the right connections to be able to know about the opportunities available to you. I would not know about any of this if I was not in CYC. And I think making this information more accessible to students, or even just telling them about it in any type of way, I think would be really beneficial for them, because I know a lot of different students want change in schools, but they're not sure how to go about that. And if it was just advertised that they can testify and that they can use their voice to make a change, then I feel like a lot more students would feel like they're being heard by their schools.
I definitely agree with what Olivia and Sandy said. I feel like they pretty much said what I was going to say. But I have testified before for the DPS board, and at the same time, it was a process of I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know that it was an option. But I also didn't, like most of my community, not even my family knew that was an option. Usually when we had something to say or something was going on in our school or in our community, we just like kept it to ourselves, because we didn't know that there was a way for us to communicate it. And like they said before, I feel like just spreading it and like spreading the word, and also trying to make it a little more like, for example, we're having a call right now. I really like the idea that it's something that a lot of people can join, and it's not like very restrictive. It's very open, and yeah, I feel like they pretty much said it all, of just spreading awareness and making this more accessible.
Thank you all for that. Does anyone know the process for gaining access to the state board?
Dan, I can start, and if you want to follow up or add anything. The State Board of Ed meets regularly. They meet monthly, actually. It's usually the second Wednesday and Thursday of the month. You know, when the pandemic kind of disrupted all of the things we did, the board immediately went to a web platform where they were meeting that way. And I think it's a little bit intimidating to folks to sign up for public comment, especially when you know that a lot of people are watching and are listening, and that you're speaking to elected officials who have the power to make change. So one of the ways that I feel like they've been very accessible is that you can attend the meetings. One of the challenges is though the times that the meetings are held. Usually those meetings go all day Wednesday, all day Thursday. And so under normal circumstances, if you're a working parent and or you're a teacher or you're a student, you're probably in school or in class or working. And so there are other ways to access your specific board members. So based on where you live, you have a board member that represents your county, your area. And the director of state board relations, Angela Maramba, usually has her her email where she shares on the website that you can contact her, and if you're a constituent, if you're a person that lives in that state board of ed's county, you're able to speak with them. And then I think the other piece is if you're not able to attend in person, Dan alluded to the rulemaking authority that the Department of Education, or excuse me, that the State Board of Ed has. So when a bill passes the legislature in session, and then has to go through this process where it promulgates rulemaking, the board essentially has some say in how those rules are shifted, or what that regulation actually looks like in practice. So oftentimes another way for folks to be involved or to share their opinion is in rulemaking, where you don't necessarily agree with the rule, or the rule can be made better with certain language. So there's a lot of different ways, I think, to access board members, but predominantly I think attending board meetings, signing up for public comment, and then contacting the director of state board relations to put you in contact with your respective board member is probably the best way. And Dan, I'd look to you for any other additional thoughts that you might have for folks.
No, I think you've covered all the bases, Stephanie. I guess the only thing I would add is that in this virtual world in which so many of us find ourselves right now, perhaps that presents some additional opportunity for engagement, because it at least cuts out a lot of the travel component, which can be an impediment to engaging, and public comment can be provided perhaps a little bit more readily in the virtual environment.
Yeah, and I do think it's kind of the same perspective. Like, I know a lot of us are fearful of approaching our legislators, but the legislators work for you all. The same thing with the State Board of Ed. I mean, they represent a whole group of children. They represent over 900,000 kids. And so, I think they want to hear from you. And in fact, I ran into Joyce Rankin at a meeting, and it was just talking there and having a conversation. And sometimes you forget that they've taken on a very hard role and they make hard decisions, but they're people and they want to talk to the people that they serve. So if you want to reach out to them via email, or you ask them to have a coffee, I'm sure that especially if you're a constituent, or if you're somebody that has a concern to bring to the state board member, they'd be more than willing to meet with the people that they serve.
Again, this could be with anyone who's had any experience testifying to any sort of elected official or district official, but why would you all say it's important who sits on the state board?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we've been talking about can feel very distant and away from people's everyday lives, but I'll just offer at least one example of a situation where this can be very real, and the decisions that the state board make can have impacts on lives of hundreds of families. And I mentioned before how a lot of the decisions the state board makes have to do with charter schools. And a couple of years ago, there was a charter school in Aurora that the local district was looking to revoke or close down the charter school. And that would have had dramatic impacts on the lives of a lot of families attending that school. And because the state board, as I mentioned, is responsible for making decisions when there's a dispute, so the charter school disagreed with the decision the school district had made, and they brought an appeal to the state board. And the decision that state board was making was going to have real effects and real impacts on those students and those families being able to continue to attend that school. And they did vote to keep that school open. And it is a school doing great work in Aurora Public Schools. And so I think that just, to me, that speaks to how important these decisions are, because they have very real impacts on the lives of students and families.
Yeah, and I think as it relates to testifying and ensuring that they hear from you with some of these big decisions, I think there's this perception that the public isn't as engaged or as involved as it relates to some of the rulemaking authority that the department has. But I think or that the State Board of Ed has, rather. I keep on using them interchangeably, and I apologize for that. But one of the things that I think is important to know is when we think about our educators, right, there's so many licensing requirements. There are things that educators need to do in order to be in the classroom. And, one of the decisions that the board makes is how many hours of, their professional development has to go towards something specific, right? Like in the coming months, they're going to be voting on rules for behavioral health requirements for educators. I don't know how many of you know, but last session, there was a bill that passed that said 10 of the 90 hours that teachers are required to complete as part of their licensure process has to be in behavioral health training. And so there are places like that where the board is inserting some rules around what that program looks like and what those requirements look like. And you have every right to comment on how those rules look and to provide input to the board as they're making the decision about how to implement this program moving forward for educators. So there's a host of things that they make decisions on, including the budget. They're going to be approving the budget here, in the next month or so, or the next week or so, excuse me, as it needs to go before the legislature as we're thinking about, the state of education funding and some of those pieces. And so they're also tasked with making some pretty tough decisions in that realm. And I think it's important that, for the issues that do come before the board, that we speak to things that impact us. And a lot of those decisions impact us in discrete ways.
Sam, do you or students, do you all have anything to say? I was like, why is it important who sits on the state board?
Yeah, I think from a student perspective, and I will be able to vote like really pretty soon. It's really important, especially to pay attention with local elections, like especially the state board, because there's a lot of emphasis placed on like the presidential election, but like a big part of the decisions that are made like about people personally is through local elections and local elected officials. And like as a student, the State Board of Education is making decisions that directly affect me and anyone that has a connection to schools. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to elections and to who is representing you, because like that's exactly what they are. As a representatives, you want to make sure that these elected officials have the same priorities as you do and will be emphasizing what you, like the community, like the people want to be emphasized.
The only thing I might add to that is thinking about communication as a two-way street and what it means to be responsive as a state board member. I think we already talked about it's sort of burdensome to, state board members ask community to come to and testify to them, like come to their space. And I think that's really limiting. Really, we have to rely on folks like the Colorado Children's Campaign and the League who have the resources to send people there all day Wednesday. And so I'm just, I think for me, what is really important is to have representatives on the state board that will go out into the community and that will listen, that will truly listen, and not just rely on people coming to them to share their priorities and needs, but to have that two-way communication and build the infrastructure of communication so that we can really understand what parents are going through, what students are going through, and teachers as well.
Thank you both for that. A question for students. What are some needs you all would like your current state board to know or candidates?
This has been a big topic in the student community, but the idea of mental health in schools and mental health access. Mental health has like a big negative stigma around it. And so a lot of students aren't getting the help that they need, and they're not able to even access these resources. Mental health, you think of like therapists and people who cost hundreds of dollars who you just can't afford at the moment. And I just think that making mental health accessible in schools for students, and then also opening like the door to say that, hey, mental health is something that everybody goes through. Everybody is affected by it, and it's not something to be ashamed of. You can talk to anybody who you trust about it. I think will be very important, especially now during the COVID time. A lot of students are suffering and feeling unmotivated, and they don't have anybody to talk to. So I think state board members keeping that in mind, that students' mental health is being negatively affected right now, would be really important.
I would say representation is something that we really need. We really need during this time because I personally don't know much about the state board, and I don't think my community knows about it, and I feel like there's not enough, um, I guess, different like ways my community could get to know about it, especially low income communities who aren't aware about these type of things and who might not be able to voice out problems that are directly affecting them. And so I feel like besides having these type of conversations, there should be conversations steered towards how to make it as in a way as welcoming and as open for people to continue having these conversations, because like mentioned before, it is very intimidating to talk to a representative, and it's very scary to talk to someone who probably has not lived the same experiences as you have. So I don't know if that's a suggestion or if it's possible to do, but I would say representation is everything, and it would encourage more people to speak out and to communicate about what they're going through.
Another question for students is that during COVID-19, schooling looks really different from what it traditionally looks like. What is something that the state board can do for you all right now while you are all in school during COVID-19?
Well, just like expanding on what Sam said earlier about like accessibility of speaking to representatives, I think now this time is very confusing. Like myself and my school and the district, like no one has a clear idea of what's going on because the situation is just so volatile and unpredictable right now. So I think having more outlets to be able to speak to those people in power would be really helpful, because it seems like there's a very limited amount of answers out there currently for members of the community. Yeah, so I guess if that's possible, to have more spaces in order to have conversations and for members of the community to ask questions to elected officials.
I agree with Sandy, and my answer is practically the same. I would say to listen more to students and keep trying to find different ways to have spaces where students are a part of this, and it's not only like panelists that we're like a part of this. Since a lot of decisions are being made, and we're not a part of those conversations because we can't vote or because we're not old enough, right? But these times can be very hard to find the light at the end of the tunnel, and especially when there's no answers, and especially when a lot of school leaders don't know what's going on either. And having more spaces where it's more student oriented and more student based, I guess, it would be more of a peace of mind for students, especially when it's hard to navigate through this.
Thank you all for that. We just had another question come in. So the state board oversees CDE, who has a strategic plan for education in the state. What priorities should they be focusing on in that strategic plan?
I'm happy to share. I think, the students said a lot of, I don't know, really salient things that I agree with in terms of the plan. I know that Rhonda and her team at the Department of Education have tried to put out the reopening guidance. And I think in terms of, what the state should be collecting and what we should know about students right now, we don't, right? I think that we know very little about the districts that are hybrid versus remote versus in person. And even when we think about access to instructional time or access to, behavioral health supports, as some of these young people have mentioned, I don't think we have, a clear idea of what that looks like. I think, there are a lot of parameters, and the pivot to local control, which our state is a local control state for better or for worse, means that there are some limitations as to what the Department of Education collects from districts. And so I think during this pandemic, it's kind of like laid bare some of the real challenges in our education system, but it also has shown us where like the department, I think, needs to step in and provide that support to districts, especially the districts that don't necessarily have, the amount of support or the funding or the district staff. Like I think of, rural districts that maybe the superintendent is the school nutrition provider, is the PE coach, is the history teacher. In communities like that where there's just we're drinking out of a fire hose, or they're drinking out of a fire hose in terms of understanding like how do we operate in a COVID time period when we know that it's going to be like this for at least the next year. And so I think it's important for us to not only identify like where districts are at in all those pieces, but to provide the support that districts need in getting that information to the state, right? And even in terms of the number of students that have enrolled, I'm sure you all have read in the news that like enrollment numbers are down, and some kids are opting to be homeschooled, and some kids are moving out of state. And so we don't even have a very clear picture of that at the moment. And I know the department, again, has done a lot of really important work to try to understand that, but this pandemic kind of really swept the rug out from under us in terms of systems that were kind of fissured and had enough of their own fractures. And now it's just created this massive gap in what we need and what we don't know about students around the state, and what educators and other district staff might need. So I think they've tried to do a lot of work with that reopening guidance and have tried their best, but there's still so much that we don't know, and it's really unacceptable at this point in time, given that we've been in we've been in this pandemic now for 6 months, and it looks like we will be for the next year or so. So I turn to others, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I would love to hear the students' perspective, in particular on this question. I'll just add very quickly, and I know the whole world has been turned on its head because of COVID, but fundamentally, I think the direction needs to be, and the plan needs to be focused on how do we make sure every child in the state has access to high quality public school options, and I feel like that is the core focus of what we need to be working on. That is the vision of what the Colorado League of Charter Schools is all about. And I hope we can just get back sooner than later to being able to have those conversations about making sure all kids have access to high quality schools.
Sam or students, I can repeat the question if you all need me to. So the question was that the state board oversees the Colorado Department of Education, who has a strategic plan for education in the state. What priorities should they be focusing on in that strategic plan?
Just from my experience, I believe like my teachers have told me that DPS has implemented like a specific number of hours. There must be like in-class, like virtual face-to-face learning. And there is some room for flexibility for teachers in their lesson plans. But especially since like I go to Denver School of the Arts, it's mostly white, pretty affluent. I think it's easy for us to have like high quality education and to have like parents and students advocate for themselves in terms of education and what they need. And so I think that like more flexibility should be prioritized in like how this virtual learning should be enacted and how we're navigating this situation. And I think maybe there should be like more emphasis placed on, I guess, schools with lower income students and those who don't have access to resources, like in general, even without this whole pandemic. Yeah.
I think Sandy brings up a good point, and that should be, at least in my opinion, CDE's main and the state board's main objective here should be equity. And there needs to be an explicit plan for how to reduce gaps. And I think just, this is not a novel idea, but COVID is exacerbating gaps among our students. Families with money are fine. They have money for pods. They're more likely to have students with tech access in their own rooms. Whereas there are a lot of students right now in Colorado who are coming from low-income families who might be transitory or even homeless and are getting lost. I mean, some of the numbers around what percentage of students are not engaging in online learning is it's terrible. And I think that really, that, at least in my opinion, should be the priority of the state board and CDE.
Thank you all.
It's all right. Well, now you got me on a soapbox, Valeria. I'm sorry. One final thing, and that is the control over a budget is a powerful thing. And I get that the legislature votes on it, but, and I also understand that school finance, that's legislative in many ways. But our school finance system, who gets money in the state, is vastly inequitable. And I do think that there is some responsibility for the state board when they make their budget proposal to account for that and try to channel resources to those districts and those schools and those students with the most need. I'm done.
Please don't apologize, Sam. I thought that was great. Just want to remind our audience that we do have some time for questions if you all have any, and we have one right now. And that is, one of the roles of the State Board of Education is to approve research proposals from groups looking to request additional data from the CDE. How has that impacted your organization and the work that you all do, if it has?
I mean, I'll start out by just saying, one of those proposals in the past has been with an organization called Carillo, which is an organization out of Stanford University that specifically focuses on like the results of charter schools. And that is something that's very important to us as we try to make sure that, yes, charter schools consistently are raising the bar for students and families across the state. So that's one aspect of where one data agreement in particular has been very important for the work in the charter school space. I do think in general, and this sort of harkens back to some of what others have said, like if we want to have an accurate pulse of what learning loss is happening right now and where different student populations are falling, it's just critical that we find ways to gather that information as soon as possible, because the longer we go without being able to get any sense of how kids are doing and how they're doing in the virtual environment, the harder it's going to be to put strategies in place to correct for that. So that's just a general note on that.
Thank you. The question was, so the state board approves research proposals from groups looking to request data from the Colorado Department of Education. Has that impacted your work and your organizations? If it has, how has that impacted it?
Thanks, Valeria. I have, from the Children's Campaign perspective, every year our incredible research team puts out our kids count research, and it basically has the state of Colorado kids. And our research team uses a variety of data sources, some included from the Department of Education, but American Community Survey is another one that they rely on. There's several sources. But I think it's become increasingly challenging for our staff to access that data. And I think part of it is because of the data suppression rules that have been put into place over the last few years. Sam mentioned the data quality campaign. I think the fact is that we still don't know how certain groups of kids are doing in certain places because of this data suppression piece. And so, it has made the work of the Children's Campaign a little bit more challenging. And I know they put, our research team puts those data requests in sooner rather than later, but those pieces do have to go before the State Board of Ed. And I think that information is important for families and for members of, our state to know what's going on. And to Dan's earlier point in terms of learning loss and some of those pieces, I don't even think we can begin to have that conversation without having what's publicly available to Colorado residents and taxpayers. And I think that's the piece too that I think we've been supportive of those efforts of A+ and of other folks that have led the data quality campaign for that reason.
Thank you. Sam, if you don't have anything, I can move on to another question that's been asked. Another question is, Stephanie mentioned that we see ourselves as a local control, and Dan gave an example where the state board overruled a local school board. Can you help us understand the issues of who has the greater authority for accountability? Or another area, the state board or the local boards?
That's a great question. I think what's fascinating about Colorado is, you often hear people say, like, we're a local control state. And through that lens, local school districts often have a lot of control over the determinations that get made in their local school boundaries. But at the same time, the State Board of Education under law and under the Constitution is responsible for the general supervision of public education in the state of Colorado. And so oftentimes that creates some interesting tension lines around, like, if things are coming up short in particular local school districts, where is the authority of the State Board of Education to step in and assume more of a role around making sure the situation is getting course corrected and being improved. That also is why why charter schools often end up being one of the decision points that gets made at the State Board of Education, because there can be a dispute at a local school district about a decision related to a charter school. And the decision that the State Board then has to make is what is in the best interest, and this is a very difficult decision to make, but what is in the best interest of the students, the community, and the school district in that situation. And so that is, another place where this issue of local control versus the general supervision of public education in the state really comes to the fore in the case of charter schools.
Yeah, and I think from an accountability perspective, our state has an accountability law for local districts that have been identified as underperforming for several years. So once they reach a certain number of years, the state board is required to intervene to make a decision around, do we turn this over to another authorizer? Do we bring in an external managing organization to help this district improve? And so, I think Dan made a really good point around how much autonomy they have, but when it comes to when they're not serving their students well, the accountability law requires the State Board of Ed to make a decision around how long are we going to allow this to go on and what are our options. Stripping accreditation is something that the board can do. They can turn it over to another authorizer. There's a number of levers that they have and a number of decisions that they make. And as Dan mentioned, like, those decisions are not made lightly. And I think in terms of the number of schools that have come before the board, there have been fewer than you would expect since the accountability proceedings started. And so I think they do a great job of, I think some of the students mentioned this point, identifying districts and schools that need additional support and interventions. And I do think we could do more in identifying schools on the front end. But I think there were some changes made to the accountability law recently where CD and the Department of Ed are trying to intervene earlier when they can identify those schools and those districts that are not serving their students well. So in many cases, Dan was totally right in terms of how much autonomy local school districts have, or local boards rather. But there's still some room for the State Board of Ed to make those really challenging decisions.
Thank you. We have a question that came in for students. So one way to determine learning loss is through district and state testing. How do the students feel about that in the current environment that is predominantly home-based schooling instead of in-person schooling?
I don't think that state testing would be an accurate way to determine learning loss during this time. I think that now there's not a lot of like guards and protections against state testing to sorry, I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. Hold on, I need to think for a little bit.
That's okay, no worries. If anyone else wants to jump in there, don't worry, Olivia, take all the time you need.
Yeah, I think standardized tests in general are a little difficult in like determining like loss of learning, because I don't think learning can be placed on the XY axis that standardized tests want it to be on. So just like in general, even before everything was pretty home-based. And so especially the fact that we are virtual and like the set of factors that are involved in learning are so completely different now. Like students are definitely more stressed just with everything going on in the world, and like the quality of education is just not the same because you don't have that face-to-face with teachers, and there's not enough like, and you don't get to connect with your peers, and it's like pretty isolated. So I think that has a negative effect on learning as well. So I don't think standardized testing should have as much emphasis in this situation, because like already in general, it's not the best form of indication. And I think that like the mental state of students as well as teachers needs to be taken into account when trying to figure out like loss of learning.
Yeah, Sandy was basically said what I was trying to say. I don't think that it was ever very accurate to really determine anything about the students. And I think now with so many things being different and students being placed in very different environments, I don't think it can accurately give them any data. I think right now what they need to do is actually listen to the students and what they have to say instead of just looking at the data. I know that I can like ace a state test, but that doesn't really mean that I actually really learned anything. I don't feel that I've actually been able to retain any of the information or learn anything new about the subjects that I'm now focusing on. If you were to ask me to like verbally explain it to you, I would not be able to do that, but I would be able to mark it on like a multiple choice question what the right answer is. I think asking students directly how they feel that their learning was affected during this time would be most effective for this situation, because everybody's coming from such different environments, and giving them a test that isn't really equitable for all, I don't think it would determine the right results.
Also, if I can just add one more thing, sorry if I'm talking too much, but since like standardized testing has such a big impact on funding with schools, I also think that's a big factor as to why it shouldn't be as emphasized in this situation, because I don't think schools deserve to get less funding because they didn't do as well on standardized tests this year, since everything has been crazy.
Thank you. Please don't apologize. We want to hear from you. Deja, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, they pretty much said everything I had to say. I think that during these times, we should be taking into consideration all the different factors like home life and the students' lack of accessibility to like tech or to the materials they need for school. That could not that could prevent them from doing well in the state test. Besides that, I feel like tests are also very can be very in a way limiting towards the students' ability. It doesn't really tell you who they are as a person and any other qualities besides their academic abilities, which are important, but should not be the primary focus during this time when students' mental health is deteriorating and when there's a lot of things going on in the world that should be talked about and should be taken into account.
Thank you for that. We just got a comment that testing doesn't affect how schools are funded. I don't know, I personally cannot speak to that as I'm not sure 100% how school finance works, but if anyone can, that would be great.
I think it would just be important to clarify what the value to students of the test are. So for PSAT, SAT, and ACT, which not here in Colorado, but those tests are used for students to apply for scholarships, for FAFSA. And so do want to clarify that that's what the use of that test is for. And in terms of some of the other, in terms of some of the other summative assessments, I think those are important to capture a point in time of student learning. And so not to disregard anything that you all said, I just want to clarify. And in terms of funding, the way our funding formula works is, a per pupil amount. And then, there are different factors that are added into funding. And so the testing piece isn't necessarily associated with funding per se. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, school finance is very complicated, and I am a former educator, and I myself still get confused by that. That is all we have for questions. If there's anything that anyone wants to share that we may have missed or that we weren't asking, please, you have the time to do so now. If not, or do you, Dan? Sorry.
No, I was just going to reiterate something that was said before, which is fundamentally that these people that are elected to the State Board of Education, they're humans just like the rest of us. They get choked up on their water like all of us do. And so, I'm so impressed with the students that are here, and and others, don't be intimidated by these folks. They want to hear from you. They are elected by you. I just encourage folks to feel empowered to make your voice heard around so many of these issues with these folks. They are elected to represent you. And so just really impressed with everything you guys are doing, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, agreed. I just want to echo my appreciation to the young people on the call, and to Sam for getting folks kind of involved. And for folks who are voting for the first time, I feel like it's an intimidating process. And at the same time, there are guides. You get your blue book, but also there are organizations that I think maybe align with some of your ideas. And if those organizations have taken positions, or maybe they just explain the issue a little bit more clearly, the ballot, I feel like, is still pretty challenging to understand. And based on what I've read, you have to have at least 23 years of education to understand what's on the ballot. So if you're a first-time voter and are just feeling a little bit discouraged, there are a lot of resources out there. And again, what Dan said, I think these folks are elected officials, and it's important that they hear from you. So if there are other students on the call today who feel very strongly about change that needs to happen, that's what your elected officials are for, and that's what State Board of Education members, that's who they should be hearing from.
Yes, I just want to thank you all again for your time and for sharing your brilliance and expertise and your truth. Thank you all for joining us today. And there will be a follow-up survey that will be sent out via email. And just so everyone knows, A+ Colorado did do a voter guide, and that could be found on our website, and it just has information on Colorado and Denver measures. Thank you all so much for your time.